Paul Vario exuded an intimidating presence. As a New York boss loyal to the Lucchese family, he had a robust build and a face etched with the marks of his criminal past. Known for his strong will, he often dressed in elegant dark suits that emphasized his stature, earning him an aura of respect among his peers. Despite being captured multiple times throughout his life, these incidents were merely setbacks for a man intent on leaving his mark in the criminal underworld. Notably, he played a key role in orchestrating one of the most iconic heists in U.S. history, which, adjusted for inflation, amounted to over $28 million in today's dollars. Here follows the detailed account of Paul Vario's eventful life, a mobster whose legacy was built on both amassed wealth and years behind bars. Paul Frank Vario came into the world on July 10, 1914, in New York City. His childhood was spent in the Old Mill area of South Brooklyn, a neighborhood where the streets had their own set of rules, and where the innocence of youth was often lost prematurely. At the time, New York was undergoing a significant economic shift, with industrialization and urbanization reshaping the cityscape. Factories producing textiles, machinery, and food operated around the clock, drawing in waves of immigrants eager to find their niche in this burgeoning economy. The First World War further fueled this boom, with the demand for war supplies ensuring that industries operated at full capacity. However, this era of growth wasn't without its shadows. As the city expanded, so did the influence of organized crime. In the poorer districts, where the system often failed, Mafia groups stepped in, exploiting social instability to establish their power. They offered protection and illicit opportunities, carving out a niche in a society where many immigrants were struggling to make ends meet. In this setting, Gaetano Tommy Reina rose to prominence, laying the groundwork for what would become the Lucchese crime family. In 1925, an 11-year-old Paul Vario had his initial encounter with the law, charged with truancy. This seemingly trivial offense resulted in him spending about 7 months in a juvenile detention center. At first, this might appear as an overly harsh penalty, but in early 20th century America, such severity was common in handling juvenile delinquency. The facility where Paul served his time was emblematic of the era, marked by overcrowding, harsh discipline, and a total absence of rehabilitative efforts. Instead of guiding young offenders back into society, these centers often produced more bitterness, with strict regimes and regular punishments fostering a tougher, more street-savvy character. In this environment, Vario likely learned lessons far more applicable to life on the streets than any form of rehabilitation. Despite his youth, he was not alone. He was surrounded by other young individuals who were also beginning to entangle their lives with the intricate world of crime. In the early 1930s, Paul met Vita Rizzuto, and by 1935 they were married, though their union was more one of convenience than love. Vita navigated this complex life alongside Paul, albeit from a cautious distance. They had 3 sons together: Paul Jr., Leonard, and Peter, who grew up under the heavy, unspoken burden of their surname, a name that commanded both respect and fear beyond the walls of their home. In February 1937, Paul and Anthony Romano were accused by a 16-year-old girl of committing acts against her. She alleged that the incident happened on September 13th of the previous year, with 2 additional men also implicated. She detailed the event. "I was sitting in a car with a friend when they approached. They forced their way into the car, threatened me with a gun, and drove me to a secluded spot where I was forced into sexual acts." The case only surfaced when the victim and her friend reported it to the police. The trial was significantly delayed due to intimidation tactics employed against witnesses, including threats directed at the victim and her family. The criminals faced misfortune as the victim courageously spoke against Vario and Romano, verifying his participation in the theft. On April 8th, an indictment came from a grand jury for the offenses mentioned. The trial started in early November. Both were found guilty and given a sentence of 10 to 20 years at Sing Sing prison. Vario received parole on 2 occasions during his incarceration, but each time his liberty was fleeting because of new crimes that sent him back to jail. His initial parole was after serving some of his sentence. However, he soon returned to criminal acts, including robbery and other violations of his parole conditions. He was once again paroled after further imprisonment, but like before, he engaged in illegal activities soon after being freed. In 1962, after nearly 25 years behind bars, Paul Vario walked out of prison with more than just his freedom. He brought with him the hard-won knowledge from his time inside and a fierce determination to carve out his own criminal empire. His release was marked by a clear ambition to cement his status within organized crime. Time was of the essence, and he had no intention of letting legal constraints slow him down any longer. Paul swiftly ascended to the position of coporigem within the Lucchese loot crime family. Respect was something he commanded, not received passively, and managed his crew with a cold, calculated efficiency. His operations at John F. Kennedy Airport were just beginning, but showed promising signs of control and dominance. During this period, he aligned himself with figures who would soon echo through the criminal underworld like the beat of war drums: Jimmy Burke, Thomas D. Simone, and Henry Hill. Vario was the type of man who viewed power as a two-sided coin. He doled it out to secure allegiance, but ensured he recouped it with interest. Henry Hill was among the first to be ensnared by the allure of the life his future mentor represented. To a local kid, the opportunities Vario's mentorship opened were not merely chances. They were pledges of a future illuminated by the allure of quick, illicit gains. Hill began with small tasks, running messages, picking locks, committing minor break-ins, and absorbing the tacit rules of the underworld. Paul took him under his wing, all the while binding him with an unspoken contract of absolute loyalty, even in moments when the situation turned dark and dangerous. Jimmy Burke was an Irishman who had his own gang of people who carried out armed robberies, kidnappings, and murders. His group was known as the Roberts Lounge Crew, and both Hill and DeSimone were members of it. He was perhaps one of the more independent members of that criminal group. Thomas DeSimone, on the other hand, was a hurricane out of control, a man whose violence was as natural as his breathing. Paul tolerated him, perhaps even admired him, but always from a safe distance. In that world, brute force had its place, with one condition: only if used in the right measure. Tommy, however, was anything but precise. His hands were stained with blood as easily as they were with soap and water when he washed them. Paul saw the potential and also the danger. Both qualities were present, and in a world where one misstep could bring down the entire operation, danger was a burden that had to be handled carefully. Around this time, his marriage to Vita concluded in divorce. While the official reasons remain undocumented, rumors suggest the strain of living with a man whose life was steeped in peril and deceit. Furthermore, the specific reasons for his extended incarceration are not disclosed. Back on the streets of Brooklyn, particularly in Canarsie, Vario's name started to be associated with enterprises that blurred the lines between legitimate business and criminal activity. His return was far from low profile. His re-entry into society was marked by an expansion of his power, centered around two unassuming locations: Jeffkin's Bar on Flatlands Avenue and a dilapidated junkyard called Various Bargain Auto Parts on Avenue D. The bar, previously owned by Frank Jeffkin, transformed from a typical tavern into a strategic stronghold. Under the dim lighting, members of his crew and other Mafia associates convened to discuss illegal loans, the distribution of stolen goods, and extortion rackets. Despite law enforcement's awareness of the criminal activities harbored there, their efforts in installing surveillance equipment did little to disrupt the operations. While the bar acted as the meeting room, the junkyard, Various Bargain Auto Parts became the central hub of their criminal endeavors. The place operated as a dual entity, a legitimate auto parts business and a front where theft, smuggling, and the handling of stolen goods were commonplace. Here, trucks would disappear like cigarette smoke in the fog, only to reappear in scattered parts. The metal from the vehicles served both to feed the black market and to mask evidence. John F. Kennedy Airport, located, offered fertile ground for Paul's plans. His men, using both intimidation and bribery, dominated cargo operations, appropriating goods ranging from electronics to luxury clothing. The losses for companies were monumental. For him, however, It was simply daily earnings, money entering his pockets like air entering his lungs. Nothing to be surprised about. In the hangars and warehouses, money was not just flowing, it was roaring. Transporters and airlines paid for labor peace, a euphemism for keeping their goods from magically disappearing. The network of illicit activities grew like a hydra. For every visible head, there were dozens growing. Loans at usurious interest rates, illegal gambling and scams in local businesses generated a constant flow of money, calculated in astronomical figures. Of course, not everything he touched was illegal. He also ran legal businesses that served as a front for his clandestine activities. For example, he owned a flower shop, a restaurant, a bar, and even a taxi stand. In fact, he joked a couple of times with those close to him that he was an excellent florist and a dedicated taxi driver. That same season, following the dissolution of his first marriage, Paul met Phyllis Joan McConaughey. They later married, entering into a relationship characterized by frequent violence and constant friction. Vario, whose temper was akin to a ticking bomb, often displayed a lack of regard for basic decorum. One evening at a restaurant, the head waiter seemed to prioritize other patrons over them. Paul loudly expressed his irritation about the wait, and even after they were seated, the troubles didn't end. A waiter accidentally spilled wine on Phyllis's dress. It was clearly an accident, but Vario saw it as an insult. The waiter's attempt to rectify the situation by cleaning the dress with a napkin only worsened matters. Vario perceived this as a direct affront, leading to a tumultuous scene filled with yelling and physical confrontations, more fitting for a police interrogation than a fine dining venue. After the restaurant closed for the night, he dispatched some of his henchmen equipped with pipes and baseball bats to assault the unsuspecting waiters. It was considered part of the job. Despite his volatile nature and potential for betrayal, Phyllis stood by him through all those years. In 1965, Ciderhurst and Inwood, affluent areas on Long Island, became Paul Vario's new domains to conquer. These neighborhoods, where illegal gambling was practically a local custom, now fell under the dominion of a man adept at capitalizing on people's desperation. Local operators were presented with a stark choice: join forces or vanish, and many opted for the latter without much debate. The profits were immense. Daily earnings exceeded $25,000, a constant flow of income that solidified his standing within the Lucchese family. Yet this wealth came with a cost, primarily in the form of law enforcement attention. By year's end, Paul and 8 of his associates were arrested. The charges were clear-cut, running an unlicensed gambling operation. But with his history, these legal scuffles were merely bothersome intermissions in his ongoing business. When he went to trial in February 1966, the scene at the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse was nearly theatrical. It was filled with zealous prosecutors and pompous attorneys, while Vario observed from his seat, calm and almost amused by the proceedings. He was well aware that the judicial system was full of more holes than a sieve, and that money and intimidation could seal any of them shut. The charges, this time for operating without a federal gambling stamp, were only serious for those unaware of how the real game was played. To him, it was just a setback. He walked away from this ordeal unscathed. It wasn't long before the authorities made another move. In June, he was arrested once again by Nassau County officials, this time with 17 accomplices in tow. The charges echoed those from before, and so did his responses. Expensive lawyers, witnesses with conveniently foggy memories, and a legal system that seemed to yield under the pressure of financial influence. To most, this pattern of arrests would signal it was time to retire. But for Paul, these were merely speed bumps on a road lined with money and built over the wreckage of others' lives. Rumor had it that by now, the mobster had hidden away $1 million in one vault alone, an undeniably impressive sum. Henry Hill recalled with admiration and fear how his protector boasted about that sum, not so much because of the amount, but because it represented his absolute control over what he did. Meanwhile, Vario served as unofficial consigliere to the acting boss of the Lucchese family, Carmine Tremonti. Although it was an unofficial role, his influence was undeniable. When he spoke, he was listened to. When he gave orders, they were carried out. Tremonti knew that having him around was both insurance and a double-edged sword. In 1970, Paul, who was adept at bending the system without drawing attention, encountered an unforeseen setback. He found himself confined within the harsh confines of a cell at the Nassau County Correctional Center. His official charge, contempt of court, seemed almost trivial compared to the vast array of crimes he was involved in, crimes that could fill numerous files with documents and evidence. The 7-month sentence served as a stark reminder that, regardless of his influence, even the mighty could be brought down, albeit temporarily. Prison, however, was not a place for remorse, but for strategizing. Despite his incarceration, his corrupt operations continued to run smoothly, and the 7 months passed swiftly. During this period, the authorities started to apply more pressure. Even into the next year, things continued to unravel for him. In April 1972, law enforcement, tired of chasing blurry trails, planted a listening device in his trailer, located in his junkyard in Canarsie. The recorded conversations painted a stark and brazen picture of the activities of the kingpin, who didn't even suspect that he was surrounded by listening ears. To rub salt in his wounds, an undercover detective equipped with another listening device began frequenting the trailer. The gangster, confident and perhaps too cocky, assumed that the policeman was corrupt. With a mixture of arrogance and carelessness, he began to offer him bribes. The surveillance operation lasted 6 months, enough time to gather conclusive evidence. In October, the game was up. Police raided Paul's junkyard, a place that had until then been his stronghold. Barely a month later, on November 1st, he was charged with witness tampering. According to authorities, he had advised Frank Heidman, a convicted gambler, to flee to Florida to avoid testifying before a grand jury in Nassau County. His arrest could be described with many adjectives. Discreet was certainly not one of them. After a thrilling 20-minute chase through Brooklyn streets, the police finally halted his car. As the year ended, his legal troubles amassed like a storm without an escape. On November 21st, Paul was officially charged with insurance fraud. The case centered on an elaborate scheme where he and his accomplices made a boat the focal point of their deceit. Stripped of all valuables, the boat was sunk in the murky waters of illegality, only to re-emerge as a $7,000 insurance claim. The operation was executed with precision. First, Vario's men stripped the boat of all sellable or reusable parts. Then, they guided it to its watery grave, where it would be claimed by oblivion. The next step was more theatrical, filing a claim with an insurance company, woven with a tale of sudden and catastrophic loss. This boat scam was not a one-off. It mirrored Paul's broader contempt for systems and morality. For him, everything was fragile, be it a ship, a system, or the ethics of those around him. His legal woes continued into December, with a guilty plea for drunk driving. Released on parole, Paul's inclination to break rules resurfaced in early 1973 when he breached his parole conditions. By February of that year, he was back in prison. On the 9th of that month, he was convicted of tax evasion, a crime that had famously caught many other mobsters before him. The number wasn't significant. What mattered was catching that big fish. By April, Vario had already been sentenced. He was handed 6 years in federal prison, a sentence he would start at Lewisburg. Lewisburg was a far cry from his bar on Flatlands Avenue or his domain on Long Island. There, his power was confined to what he could negotiate in hushed tones, out of earshot of the guards. However, Paul found a semblance of familiarity in Lewisburg. The prison housed others like him, men whose lives were built on a bedrock of crime and force. Despite being incarcerated, his reputation went before him, and his influence still stretched beyond the prison's confines. Prison wasn't the end for him. It was merely an interlude, a stark reminder that even the most shadowy empires have their periods of silence before they surge back with renewed vigor. On July 20th of that year, tragedy struck in a manner beyond the reach of his violence or power. Leonard Vario, the son of our protagonist, met his demise at the age of 23, leaving behind a mystery cloaked in fire and silence. His body, with burns covering over 90% of his skin, was left at the hospital entrance by 2 men who vanished without a trace. Leonard, alive but in agony, steadfastly refused to disclose how he came to be in that condition. His endurance of pain was only outdone by his commitment to the code of silence his family lived by. That same night, an explosion obliterated a nearby warehouse, followed by a fire that devoured everything in its wake. The authorities were quick to label it arson, yet no one was eager to probe further. Whispers about Leonard's involvement with the explosion began to circulate. However, Leonard did not survive, and for his family, his death was a profound tragedy. Paul Vario, amidst this emotional turmoil, displayed little public grief. At the cemetery, as his son's coffin was lowered into the ground, the silence was palpable, a testament to the inescapable legacy of their life. Their emotions of anger, frustration, and sadness overflowed the bounds of decency. 2 television cameramen and a police detective were beaten by the audience, as if Paul's fury lived in each one of them. In 1975, he crossed the gates of the federal prison after having served just over 2 years of a sentence that initially promised 6. It was not a triumphant return, nor a disgraced departure. It was simply the kind of transaction the system offered to men like him, a brief confinement to balance the scales that were often tilted. Nor was he a changed man, for change to an honest life was not in his nature. After more than 6 decades of life, the bars had not managed to stifle the ambition or cynicism that defined him. No, giving up was definitely not an option. When he left, the landscape had changed. The Lucchese family, who had once recruited him as a key player, had found new hands to hold the reins. Salvatore Santoro had taken the position left vacant by Paul, under the supervision of Anthony Corallo, a leader who needed no permission from anyone to reconfigure the hierarchy as he pleased. The news must have reached him even before his cell saw him leave, but that didn't mean he cared too much. His influence did not lie in a title, but in his name and greed. That move was a silent declaration. His time of direct influence was over. But he was not one to accept irreverence and backstabbing easily. His immediate fate took him south to a residence near Miami, a discreet exile that combined the warm air of Florida with memories of a world he could not leave behind. There, among palm trees and a pace of life that simulated tranquility, he resumed his role as a cog in a much larger machine. He was not the visible man he once was, but he still had the power to approve key moves. In the distance, the gears of his criminal machine continued to turn, fueled by decades of bought loyalties, intimidation, and ruthless pragmatism. The Lufthansa robbery, executed on December 11, 1978, at John F. Kennedy International Airport, was more than just a bold hit. It was an act that exuded the meticulous coldness and cynicism inherent in the world of organized crime. The protagonists of this operation, figures linked to the Lucchese family, wove a network of complicity that turned the cargo terminal into the scene of one of the most famous robberies in American history. It all began with a whisper, a plan conceived by 2 Lufthansa employees, Peter Grunwald and Louis Werner. The 2 had identified a cash shipment from Germany, a temptation too great to ignore. However, they were not men of action. They needed the machinery of crime to execute their vision. That's when Werner sought out Henry Hill, an associate of the Lucchese family, who in turn involved Jimmy Bork. With his reputation as a ruthless strategist, he sought the approval of Vario, a boss whose influence remained decisive in high-profile decisions. A call from New York shattered the apparent tranquility of his gilded exile. The proposal was ambitious and dangerously tempting, a robbery that could become the largest ever carried out on American soil. From his home in Florida, Paul listened attentively to the idea and, without needing too many details, gave his approval. So, on December 11th in the early morning, the plan was put into motion. A black Ford Econoline arrived at Building 261 of the cargo terminal. 6 masked men got out of the vehicle carrying tools and guns that wouldn't fire. Werner had provided the key to get in. Once inside, it was all a matter of timing. Within minutes, the employees were herded into the dining room under the threat of guns, eliminating any chance of alarm. The climax of the heist came when the night shift manager, Rudy Irish, was forced to disable the security systems and open the vault containing the loot. The thieves worked providently. 72 boxes loaded with approximately $5 million in cash and $875,000 worth of jewelry. Not a shot, not a scream, not a slip. In little more than an hour, the robbery was complete. The men disappeared in several vehicles, leaving the terminal behind as if nothing had happened. This was not only a victory for Vario and his people, but also a direct provocation to law enforcement, who were now faced with a crime that was beyond their immediate response capabilities. But in the slums of Brooklyn, that supposedly perfect plan began to show cracks. The first betrayal of secrecy came from Parnell Staggs Edwards, who was in charge of disposing of the van used in the hit. Edwards, in an act of laziness or stupidity, left the vehicle abandoned near his girlfriend's apartment. That piece of evidence was the first thread that investigators began to unravel. The initial success of the robbery, which seemed destined to enter the annals of crime as a masterpiece, quickly turned into a massacre. Jimmy Burke, paranoid that someone might tell, began a methodical purge. Edwards was the first to fall, followed by other accomplices. The initial success of the robbery, one that seemed destined to enter the annals of crime as a masterpiece, quickly turned into a massacre. Jimmy Burke, paranoid about the possibility that someone might talk, began a methodical purge. Edwards was the first to fall, followed by other accomplices whose bodies became warning signs for the rest. The mob boss Martin Krugman, a mistress named Teresa Ferrara, and an accomplice called Robert McMahon were just some of the victims. Each murder was a brutal reminder that in the world of crime, loyalty was a luxury no one could afford. One of the casualties not directly tied to the robbery was Thomas DeSimone, a longtime ally of Paul Vario. His downfall began the night Billy Batts, a made man from the Gambino family, had the misfortune of crossing paths with him in a bar. Batts, confident in his status, made the fatal mistake of mocking DeSimone, calling him a punk. The offended man's blood, hot as freshly forged steel, boiled almost instantly. With Jimmy Burke's help, DeSimone beat Batts nearly to death. Then, in an act of cold determination, finished him off and buried the body in a desolate field. That killing, more than a simple act of rage, was a declaration of war against the Gambino family. One that Tommy didn't even seem to understand, but it wasn't his only mistake. Shortly afterward, Ronald Foxy Jerothy, a man linked to John Gotti, also fell by his hand. The reason was a conflict that would have seemed trivial outside the world of organized crime, a personal dispute that ended with a point-blank gunshot. True to his nature, the alleged aggressor decided the simplest solution was to silence him permanently. Both murders violated a fundamental rule of the Mafia code. Killing a made man without permission is a death sentence. The Gambinos were not about to dismiss these acts as the reckless errors of a hot-headed young man. The news quickly reached John Gotti, a man known for holding grudges when settling scores. The decision to eliminate the offender was not taken lightly. It was a calculated execution meant not only to avenge the deaths of Batts and Jeroth, but to send a clear message to anyone who dared challenge Gambino authority. In January 1979, Tommy was summoned under the promise of an honor he had always desired. Being inducted as a made man was the dream of any aspiring mobster, a kind of canonization in a dark world. But when he arrived at the designated location, instead of a ceremony, he found himself surrounded by men who showed nothing but chilling contempt. There were no speeches, no vows of eternal loyalty. What followed was slow, deliberate brutality. According to some accounts, Gotti personally supervised the execution, ensuring that DeSimone's fate was as horrific as the deaths he himself had caused. Tommy's body was never found. Some say it was dismembered and dumped into the Atlantic Ocean. Paul's reaction to the death of his associate was ambiguous at best. In fact, there is a theory suggesting that he may have played a role in the murder by informing the Gambino family of DeSimone's violent acts. Supposedly, once DeSimone became a liability after his uncontrolled outbursts of rage, the protective instincts of his former mentor faded away. There is no record of Paul publicly expressing grief or anger over what happened. Instead, his focus appeared to be on damage control within the Lucchese family, ensuring that the consequences of DeSimone's actions would not implicate him or the rest of his crew. By then, however, the financial impact of the robbery was already irreversible. The 1980s proved no less tumultuous. Henry Hill, until then protected by Vario, was imprisoned at the end of 1980. Rumors began to swirl like the smoke from a cheap cigar. It was said that our protagonist had set his sights on Karen, the wife of the imprisoned protege. The nights he spent near Karen, under the pretense of protecting her while her husband was incarcerated, became whispers in Mafia corridors. For the pupil isolated in a prison cell, each rumor was a dagger. Prison was already hell. But knowing that the man who had shaped his career might be invading his home was an even crueler torment. Paul, a man known for his sensitivity, never bothered to deny the accusations. His power lay in his ability to do whatever he wanted, regardless of the consequences. Karen, for her part, also remained silent, neither confirming nor denying, allowing speculation to flourish. Henry grew seriously suspicious that members of the Lucchese family wanted him dead. The conditions were perfect. In 1984, the facade Paul had built began to crumble, taking with it not only his fortune but his legacy. On February 9th of that year, a federal court exposed him as the architect of a scheme that was as crude as it was bold. What he did not anticipate was that the very man he had rescued and mentored in his youth would become his executioner. That former protege, a man whose loyalty had become as volatile as his temper, decided that survival mattered more than any mafia code. Under the threat of becoming the next body on the list, he turned government witness. In a courtroom filled with murmurs and furtive glances, he recounted every setup, every bribe, every betrayal. It was a public dissection of the world Paul had built so meticulously. On April 3, 1984, the sentence was handed down. 4 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine, an absurdly small sum compared to the fortunes he had amassed, yet ironically humiliating. The millions he had earned through extortion, drug trafficking, and theft now seemed as unreachable as his former reputation. The court was judging not just one man, but an entire system, and Vario became the symbol of a mafia empire showing signs of exhaustion. In February 1985, while serving his federal sentence, fate decided it was not finished with him. New charges dragged him back into court, exposing an extortion scheme that laid bare the inner workings of the airport he controlled, a world where fear was the currency. The sentence came down like a hammer. 10 additional years in prison, another layer of chains added to those that already held him captive. As guards escorted him out of the courtroom, he likely knew this was truly the beginning of the end. In prison, his days blurred into an oppressive monotony. He was no longer the titan who controlled the flow of money and favors in the streets. Now he was just another man facing time as it marched forward without mercy. He was no longer young, well into his 70s, and began confronting his greatest enemy, his own body. Diabetes, heart problems, and the onset of lung cancer, inevitable consequences of a life of excess and stress, slowly consumed him. Money, threats, and influence could no longer protect him. His health collapsed, and the man once feared for his cruelty and cunning became a prisoner of his own weakness. On May 3, 1988, at the age of 73, Paul Vario exhaled his final breath in a stark room of the federal prison in Fort Worth. Respiratory failure caused by lung cancer claimed him, leaving his body as empty as the legacy he left behind, far from the streets he once ruled, and the men who feared to speak his name. He died in the anonymity he had always feared. When his body was returned to New York, St. John's Cemetery received him with a silence that seemed to mock the life he had lived. He is considered one of the most dangerous and untouchable criminals of his time, nearly impossible to capture due to his influence and power within criminal circles.
All right, keep your eyes open. Cause this bastard, all right?
Okay.